Hello and welcome back to this damn volatile crusade. This video's review of Kino Lorber's release of the classic horror film Burn Witch Burn. Of course, its original UK title was Night of the Eagle, which is why some people might get confused because the film has two distinct titles and opening and closings. This was distributed and co-financed by American International Pictures here, who added the new title and, of course, the custom introduction and closing, which, while a little bit on the gimmicky side, and they don't really fit the film, they are kind of fun and in an old-fashioned showmanship sort of way. They are very much trying to be more in the William Castle school of selling the picture. So don't let that put you off if you're coming to this film for the first time, because honestly, it is a extraordinarily well-produced film, of course made in England, like a lot of the great horror films of the 50s and 60s. In terms of its tone and the overall feel of the film, since it is widescreen black and white, and is very character-based and is dealing with the elements of the supernatural interfering possibly with everyday life and playing around with the ambiguity of that situation. This is very much in the sort of, I guess, the sort of Val Lewton type mold, and the film it feels closest to, at least for me, is I think this is the closest anybody ever got to sort of replicating some of the feeling of Jacques Tourneur and Night of the Demon. So if you love Night of the Demon, as you should, because it's one of the greatest horror films ever made, this should be right up your alley. The plot is a really interesting concept. You have the university professor Norman Taylor, played by Peter Wyngarde, in one of his first, well, actually, I believe this was actually his first major leading film role, and his wife, Tansy, played by Janet Blair. He works at a university, I guess, somewhere outside of London in a small sort of English town, and is very much on the rise, even though he's only been there a short period of time, and it really puts you right there in the middle of the sort of office culture or the political side of being at a university campus, which is something that not a lot of stories get into, and it's a particular little world, much like any sort of office hijinks that people have to deal with in the business world on a day-to-day basis. But particularly in the world of academia, it's a bit different, and you start to see how they interact socially with all of the other professors and couples and wives and the faculty, and how there's a lot of stuff sort of brewing under the surface, and the sort of resentment that they're sort of newcomers and slightly seen as upstarts when there are all these other people who have tenure and they've been there for years and years and years. So that adds already a nice degree of relatability and realism to the sort of setting. Taylor is a professor of psychology, and to his shock and complete surprise, discovers that his wife is actually a practitioner of witchcraft. While this seems relatively harmless, he finds all kinds of trinkets and things scattered around the house that really, it would spook most anyone, but it is all, she claims, designed to be sort of protective charms and ensure that they have good luck, and that he continues to find fortune and success in his career. It's also laid in that they have a little bit of back history and had lived some time in the tropics, where that's where his wife Tansy sort of first encountered voodoo rituals and witchcraft, and basically became indoctrinated into having some belief in it. So being the very rationally minded psychology professor he is, Taylor has puts no stock in any of this. But interestingly, instead of actually listening to his wife and having a sort of well, if this makes you feel better, essentially, he sees that there is some sort of harm in letting her put stock into these things, and insists that she drop the whole thing, and that they get rid of all of the charms and trinkets and dead spiders and things that she has put up to again essentially have sort of protective charms around them and their everyday lives. She eventually acquiesces to this, and in a great scene, he actually burns everything in a fireplace. And of course, as soon as this happens, everything in their lives seems to go to literal and absolute hell. And the question then becomes, is this all happening simply out of pure coincidence, or is there something to the witchcraft that his wife was practicing and that he puts no stock in? It starts to layer in the more otherworldly aspects that have already sort of been brewing. There's an eeriness right from the get-go that's an undercurrent in the sort of opening scenes. But again, as soon as he burns everything in the fireplace, all of that just erupts to the surface. And it's done, again, the reason why I mentioned Night of the Demon, it's that same sort of beautiful ambiguity of everything could technically be explained for the most part up to, about a certain point as being, just something that happened and having nothing to do with magic or witchcraft or voodoo. But it starts to pile up and prey on the mind, and that eeriness that's already there as an undercurrent really starts to erupt. And again, the fact that it's also in widescreen black and white and was shot in England in the early 1960s, coming off the heels of Night of the Demon just a couple years later, that's the sort of feeling that you have throughout. If this premise seems at least somewhat familiar, it should to classic horror fans, because of course this is based on Fritz Lieber's novel Conjure Wife, which was adapted a number of times and is a pretty well regarded as a classic of sort of horror fantasy fiction. It was written back in the 30s or 40s, I believe, and first adapted as the second film in Universal's Inner Sanctum series, which is the series starring Lon Chaney Jr. that was, it took the Inner Sanctum title, but it was not based on the famous radio series or any of the novels from the Simon & Schuster imprint that came up with the name. But it was turned into the second film in the series, basically an hour-long B programmer entitled Weird Woman. So if you want to see a 1944 hour B programmer sort of rendering of the same story, you can. And it is extremely well done, as I think all of the Inner Sanctum films are. I think they're very underrated. But it's basically, again, it's condensed down to an hour, and so you have Lon Chaney Jr. instead of Peter Wyngarde, and it is much more streamlined and very simplified, and it does have elements of the supernatural, but they are very, very dialed back. All of the bad and things and evil tidings are, revealed immediately to be the machinations of a jilted lover, and it's very. And again, it's very well done because they have only an hour to play with. But again, if the sort of premise seems familiar, it's because it was done first as one of the Inner Sanctum films in the 1940s by Universal. So comparing the two is not exactly fair, because here the main draw is this film was written and really spearheaded and developed by two of the greatest horror, science fiction, fantasy writers of the 20th century. This film was written and, again, developed really by Richard Matheson and Charles Beaumont, who were friends and had collaborated before, and they came up about the same time in the realms of horror, science fiction, fantasy writing, and also getting into writing screenplays and working for television, whether it be The Twilight Zone or probably their most famous film work. They both wrote for AIP, American International, and doing the Roger Corman Poe series. Richard Matheson started things and wrote most of them, but after a certain point, I think he kind of got burned out and was also doing other things, and Charles Beaumont wound up writing on and doing a lot of the later Poe films. So if you look closely at the Poe series, you can see the sort of difference between the styles of Matheson and Beaumont. They have a lot of similarities, and of course were friends in real life, but you can see they have different approaches slightly, and it's really fascinating to see how they approached collaborating here, because this, I think, has a lot of elements of each, but they're also able to get much more of the original novel on the screen and also maintain that nice ambiguity and have a much deeper sense of the lead character pairing of Peter Wyngarde and Janet Blair. They're the married couple, were able to really get much more of a sense of their relationship dynamic, and they feel much more like three-dimensional people, as opposed to what Universal had to do in a B programmer that was only an hour long. So it's obviously not going to have as much character development. And I think what makes this film really work is the amount of time that's spent in the sort of opening third, discovering the elements of witchcraft, and how the relationship dynamic works between husband and wife, and how they're able to talk about some things, but you get this sense that there's not quite that fully cemented sort of deeper trust between the two, because you can't help but think, yes, I myself wouldn't really believe in any of this, but if it's not hurting anyone, and it makes your wife seem happy and not, and be at peace, it's like, well, is it really going to hurt you that much to have a bunch of trinkets all over the house? But it also plays into his professional career, because Taylor is a professor of psychology and spends his entire life and career arguing against these things, and how people can convince themselves of things in their own mind and delude themselves. So it makes sense in terms of the story and in terms of the characters, and getting all of that set up in the beginning, and allowing the eeriness to build, and everything suddenly going to literal hell as soon as the amulets and trinkets are burned to the fireplace. That's what really allows the audience's imagination to just go from there, and that you, the audience, start plugging into things. When if you just view the scenes as they are, everything could be explained away, and you, just like the character of Taylor, start to question more and more and more, which again is the same sort of feeling that you have in Night of the Demon. So once again, I couldn't help it, but this time coming back to this film, that's the film I'm most reminded of. Some people might describe it as sort of a Hitchcockian flavor, which is apt in a way, but it's really Night of the Demon, and sort of stemming from, again, the Val Lewton school of ambiguity and psychological horror from the famous RKO horror films. That's the sort of school of thought this film is very much in. It, again, was produced in England. It's in widescreen black and white, and was distributed here by American International. Now, I alluded to before, AIP put a new title on for the U.S. Of course, the original title of the novel has never been used. And here in the U.S., I don't really mind either title. I think both titles are good. But here for the U.S. version, they did put on this rather hokey opening narration over black screen, sort of indoctrinating the viewer and placing you with a protective curse, so that way you wouldn't be affected by the things you see in the film. And then the very end card is a little cheeky, which again doesn't really fit the serious, very chilling and interesting nature of the film. The film is very intelligent throughout. It's never hokey, but the opening and the way AIP sold it doesn't really, it clashes with that. So while that is amusing, it doesn't really belong with the film, and if you see the UK version, it does not have those, and it has the original title. Apparently, I think Studio Canal has it in the UK, and I don't know if they're going to do a 4K version, but they really should. This is a definite classic of the genre, and deserves a greater reputation, because this is so well put together. And again, I have to go back to the actual the script itself and what it does with the concept, and the fact that you have Richard Matheson and Charles Beaumont working together on this story. Again, what really makes it is the association the audience gets to develop with the characters. And I think they're both really well played by Janet Blair and Peter Wyngarde. And it's amazing that this is Peter Wyngarde's first real lead performance, because he's just absolutely pitch perfect in every moment, and he allows the characters, really the imagination and the fears of the character to build over time. It's a very extraordinarily nuanced performance, and you like the guy from the get-go. He has that wonderful sort of slightly acerbic sense of internal humor to him that I think Peter Wyngarde just always had. But that starts to erode over time as he begins to get more and more concerned with the things that are happening to him in his real life. And they are legitimate, terrible concerns and truly bad things. And his fear and starts to mount along with the tension, and then the set pieces start to build in intensity until you get to the climax of the film, where I don't know if there is a better example of an actor being able to show pure terror in a physical sense, because I don't want to give away anything in this film. If you, whatever you do, don't watch the trailer first, because the U.S. trailer literally gives away every part of the film, including the climax and the big shots and everything. So do not watch the trailer first. But when you see the film and you see Peter Wyngarde's face in the climactic sequences, he is able to convey such a physical sense of terror that his actual face, like his actual skin, is literally quivering. It's not just, oh, I'm shaking because I'm scared. It's a complete sort of physical manifestation of fear and internal turmoil boiling over, whether what he's experiencing is real or not. It's an absolutely just brilliant thing. I've never quite seen another actor able to do that and really give that physical intensity, because again, there are a number of close-ups and you can just literally see him. Not only is he sweating like crazy and you can see the intensity of the fear in his eyes, but you can literally see his skin just quivering because he's just shaking that much. It's not just like, oh, I'm scared and it's cold, that type of stuff, that sort of cliche. But it was just something that really struck me coming back to the film this time. Just the wonderful nuances that Wyngarde was able to really convey in this role. The film is extremely well directed by Sidney Hayers, who was more of a British journeyman type director. He eventually wound up directing a number of episodes for great British television series, particularly The Avengers. The film is nicely low key, again, particularly in the opening, but the sense of eeriness that's developed and maintained throughout and increases is exceptionally well done. The film doesn't have the biggest budget in the world, and it really makes great use of real practical locations and, of course, photography out and using the outdoors. There's a lot of really great atmospheric moments. The couple has a cabin on a cliffside overlooking the sea, and when they go out there at dusk and at night and they're going around the craggy mountains and the long deserted beaches, it's really effective, particularly in black and white. Even stuff as simple as when Taylor drives off in his beautiful open-top car and is driving at speed through these wonderful tree-lined British country roads. There's one shot I really love where the camera's actually in the car with him, and you have all of the trees overhead flying by. It's, again, little simple things like that do add to the atmosphere and really put you there in the moment. And again, all with a low budget and being creative. Probably the most creative effect in the film. There aren't really a lot of special effects or opticals. There are a few here and there when necessary, but the most striking effect, really, outside of the climax, is there's a really nice use of first-person perspective for a particular scene when the character Tansy is sort of out of it and she starts to come to a little bit. We get this really well done first person perspective, which is actually foggy a little bit at the sides, almost a sort of iris effect, but really giving you that sort of otherworldly, I'm not quite awake type feeling. And then it actually starts to move when they pick her up and start to walk her through, which is really well done for, again, having to actually do that with the camera and move the camera around and keep the motion smooth and keep the other actors in focus. So that's probably the most striking sort of camera effect or visual moment from the direction side of things. Again, the film is extraordinarily impressive. I think probably the only thing for me, and this is because I've never read Fritz Lieber's original novel, which apparently has even more business going on and has stuff in it that has never been put into the adaptations. So I'm primarily used to the 2 film versions. I've not yet read the novel, which is available, but unfortunately it's kind of sort of, you do have to track a copy down essentially, which now I really want to do. But there are some things in the film that are not quite spelled out, and I guess maybe they are maybe a little bit more in the novel. So this is, I think, without question, the best version of the story. It has been adapted several different times in different mediums, and there have been, and since then, other stories that sort of play around in a similar vein. But here, I think it's just a prime example of all of these great elements coming together, but particularly the script and the desire to do this by Richard Matheson and Charles Beaumont, and getting American International to sign off on it. And then it was, I think, an interesting choice for AIP to have the film produced in England and made in England, because that gives it an entirely different flavor. Again, going back to, you can't escape the sort of feeling of Night of the Demon. So that is putting this film right in the realm of truly intelligent, well thought out horror that plays in the everyday, which is probably the best type of horror story outside of doing a full-bore classic gothic type horror. So this film is still incredibly well made and put together, and I didn't want to go into a lot of the plot because this is the type of film that you don't want a lot of information. You don't want to have it spoiled for you, because that would sort of ruin the experience. And it's a film that definitely grows with repeat viewings, and once you know the story twist and what happens at the climax, that adds an extra little bit of drama, because you know where this is heading for this couple, and you know what's going to happen when everything gets burned in the fireplace, and that whether you believe in the supernatural or not, the fears of Tansy are valid in some way, because there are all these bad things that are about to happen. So it's a film with incredible power. It's extremely well cast, and it's wonderfully shot, and the black and white cinematography is extraordinarily atmospheric. And I do think it is one of the best horror films of the 1960s, without question. I do think it is one of the great horror films. It's truly the kind of film they don't make anymore. It is extraordinarily well put together, and you get the sense that everyone really believed in what they were doing. And I have to once again just say that in this film, Peter Wyngarde is truly magnificent. He is still an incredibly underrated actor, and just one of those people that you just sort of instantly love the first time you see them, and then you hear how he was in real life, and you see interviews with him, and that just increases your admiration and love and respect of this person. So I think the choice to have him in the film, and he wasn't necessarily the first choice, I think that was the real masterstroke, because he adds the right layers of skepticism, and then increasing fear and tension to the performance that really sells the whole picture, I think. And it is really a two-hander between him and Janet Blair, but since the character of Tansy is frequently, for lack of a better term, sort of out of it, and sort of becomes more and more otherworldly in her behaviors here and there, it becomes much more of a one-man show throughout, and everything rests on Wyngarde's shoulders, and he just pulls it off with aplomb. So again, Burn Witch Burn, or Night of the Eagle, whichever title you prefer, is, I think, one of the truly great and very underrated horror films that kind of gets written off because of the way AIP sold it here in the U.S. But for everyone who's ever seen it, it's a film you don't forget. It very much sticks with you and is perfect for chilling the bones once more every October when it is in spooky season. It is a horror film made for all the right reasons. It deals with the macabre, but also deals with the possibilities of the supernatural and how that affects seemingly normal people in the real world. And it plays with ambiguity in such a beautiful way that I do think it is one of the great horror films of the 1960s. So that brings us to Kino Lorber's Blu-ray release, which seems to have been done in conjunction with Scorpion because they're credited on the back and they did produce a number of extras. So the transfer itself, when we talk about picture quality, it is the US version, so it has the AIP logo. It has the wonderfully cheesy opening where I don't know. I think it may be Paul Frees because it sounds like when he would do his Orson Welles impression. So I know it's been credited mistakenly sometimes to actually be Orson himself doing the narration, but it clearly isn't. But it still has that sort of feel, and it's fun in a sort of William Castle sort of way, but it doesn't really belong on this film. So that's here. So the film will open on black screen and have this voiceover. And again, the end card is very cheeky, but again, that doesn't really belong in the film either. The transfer seems to be some sort of printer interpositive element. It does have some occasional damage. You will see some flecks and specks and different things. It's never bad, and the overall picture looks quite good, but it is not a modern restoration, obviously. It's not a 4K restoration, which again, I'm not sure, but I think the film is owned by Studio Canal in the UK and Europe, so it's very possible they would do a 4K scan. This is a film that really deserves it. So overall, I think the film has a very healthy looking appearance for what it is. It's also a distinct improvement over prior releases, which the film really hasn't had many. It had the UK DVD under the original Night of the Eagle title. It's had some releases here in the US on Laserdisc and DVD, but this is the primary HD release, and it's also very inexpensive. So I do think this is the best way to see the film, and I think the quality is quite nice, but do keep in mind it's not a restoration, it's not a brand new scan. It seems to be an older pre-existing MGM HD master, which It's good for what it is, but it's clearly not been restored and it's not a new scan. But it looked far better than what I expected, so that was a nice, pleasant surprise. In terms of the audio, it is more of what I expected. It seems to also be some sort of print element sourcing. It is the original mono, of course, but there is a great degree of harshness. There is some sibilance in things. This is the type of stuff you're going to get when what's being sourced is a print element or an interpositive, or pretty much it's an optical track is what it sounds like. So there is an inherent noise floor. There is some hiss. You will hear an occasional tick or bit of noise, but nothing ever bad. But the main thing you're going to notice is there is quite a bit of harshness in the high end. There is, again, distortion a little bit in the most strident passages of music cues and the high end, and you are going to hear a harshness in the dialogue. That's going to be inherent to any time that they're having to use an optical track source. And I've only seen this film once before on an old DVD release, and it has been a long while, but from what I remember, that's sort of the look and feel of how this film has been in the past. I don't own any of the previous releases to do a direct comparison, but my guess, and since this is MGM, this is probably the best element they have, and until Studio Canal or whoever has the rights in Europe does a new scan and restoration from original elements, we're dealing with these US materials, again, from AIP. So obviously probably not the original negative, probably some interpositive source, and that also means the audio is a couple generations away. So it's not perfect, but I think it's about as good as it can be until somebody does a new restoration and scan of original materials. Now, in terms of the packaging and extras, I do really like what they did, but again, this seems to be a sort of joint venture between Kino and Scorpion. It's a little fancier than your typical Kino disc. Here we have this beautiful art rendering of one of the original U.S. posters, of course, has the U.S. title, as the film does on disc, of Burn Witch Burn, which I also like, and it is a line in the film. I'm kind of split. I don't know which title I prefer. I think both are good, but of course, Night of the Eagle has a different sort of ring to it. Again, this doesn't have the typical Kino layout, so it looks quite a bit fancier, and you would not think this was a Kino disc at first. Also, we have nice disc label art, and there is a reversible sleeve with the original primary US 1 sheet. So if you prefer that, you can have the more ostensibly vintage looking version. But the main cover is a different rendering of an alternate US poster. So the extras are actually quite substantial because we do have the original trailer, which, again, don't watch it before the film because it's the US trailer and it pretty much gives you the whole film in 2.5 minutes and it shows you everything. So avoid that until afterwards, and it's fun to see how it was sold in the US. It is actually in HD. It's a little, it looks okay, but at least it's in HD, which is a nice bonus. The two primary pieces are really important. First of all, this was apparently done by Scorpion, but they got an interview, an actual sit-down interview with Peter Wyngarde, and he's, actually reminiscing about the film and his experience making it. And he also talks about various other films and experiences in his career. And it's a nice, lengthy, it's about 25, 30 minutes long. It's quite substantial. And the man just oozed charm out of every pore. So it's absolutely just fascinating. And it's a wonderful little, well, not little, it's a pretty substantial interview piece. It's for fans of the film and fans of Wyngarde, it's a great inclusion. And you can tell that he still has, at least some great fondness for this film. And this was done, I guess, in conjunction with getting this disc release. So it is, pretty much more modern, and he is having to look back, many, many decades. But, so he talks a little bit about this film, about the innocence, about Flash Gordon and other things, and it's absolutely wonderful. The other thing, and another great draw, is this actually ports over the Richard Matheson audio commentary, which was done on the original US Laserdisc back in the 90s. That's an LD I've always wanted to get. It's a little on the harder to find side, and so it actually, the commentary being ported over, which as far as I know has not been ported over to other releases before, it's a real draw. The commentary is a great listen. It is somebody having to, of course, look back and remember things. And he does Matheson talks about other films he worked on and other parts of his career. But it's really a spot-on commentary about his ideas about the story property itself, why he decided to adapt it with Charles Beaumont, his friendship with Beaumont, how their styles sort of diverged. Matheson talks about his relationship with AIP, about Roger Corman and developing and working on the Poe films and how that was never meant to be a series. He talks about I Am Legend and The Shrinking Man and all of his other famous works, and also a little bit about working on The Twilight Zone. So again, it's a sort of talking about his whole career, but it's very candid, and even though there are some gaps in the track where he's obviously watching the film for the first time in 30 or 40 years, it never derails or becomes boring or has too long of gaps, and it is very insightful to to understanding the film and being able to better understand its great strengths, which again primarily stem from the really well done screenplay. So that's a fantastic thing, and something that doesn't happen all the time, that you have a Laserdisc era commentary ported over. So that's a really nice touch. And again, I think a sign that this isn't just your typical Kino Lorber release, that it actually does have some effort put into it with reversible art, the new interview pieces, and actually porting over the Laserdisc commentary. So I do think this is a must-own release. It is the best release of the film until somebody perhaps does a new 4K scan and restoration of the film. The extras are worth the entire cost of the disc. But this is one of the great 1960s horror films. It deserves a better reputation. It should be more widely known, and it just unfortunately isn't. I think it's a little bit more known as a great horror film in the UK than it is here in the US, because people just think AIP and they see the cheesy way it was sold. But it's a little on the obscure side, which is a shame, because this is an incredibly well-made film. This is a horror film to stir the mind and the imagination as much as to scare people or to make the hair. It's designed to make the hairs on the back of your neck stand up in all the best ways. And again, is very much continuing the sort of tradition established by Val Lewton and personified by Jacques Tourneur in the first three Lewton films, and sort of cemented in Night of the Demon, which again, that's the sort of closest approximation I can think of to relate the sort of feeling that you get in Burn, Witch, Burn, otherwise known as Night of the Eagle. Again, one of the great horror films of the 1960s, and I do think this Kino Lorber release is the best released of the film to date. It is very inexpensive, especially when it's in their site sales, so I do highly, highly recommend this to any fan of psychological horror films of Matheson or Beaumont or EIP, but especially really just all horror fans. This is one of the great horror films. This is one of the great horror films of the 1960s. So those are my thoughts on Kino's release of the horror classic Burn, Witch, Burn, otherwise known as Night of the Eagle. Again, I think this is the best release of the film to date, and I think the supplements really enhance the overall value. The packaging design and artwork is great, and also it's very inexpensive, particularly when it's in one of Kino's site sales. So again, until Studio Canal or whoever has the rights does a new scan and releases perhaps a UHD or 4K mastered version, this is the best you can do. And this is a film that really deserves to be better known and more talked about. It is incredibly well produced. Again, not on the greatest budget in the world, which makes it all the more admirable. And I do think it is one of the greatest horror films of the 1960s. It is a must-see for all horror fans, and it's a film that I think you'll want to return to time and time again. It is a true classic of the genre and deserves to be recognized as such, even if you're watching the US version with the wonderfully William Castle-esque cheesy opening and closing credit materials. So as always, I hope this has been at least somewhat fun and informative to hear me babble on once again about classic films. Please do keep supporting boutique labels and studio labels by buying films on disc to help keep physical media alive. And as always, thanks ever so much for watching.